Hey, everybody. Tuesday, 1 o'clock, little after 1. I am back in my office after a phenomenal staff lunch given to us by our wonderful hospitality ladies as part of Pastor Appreciation Month. And there was Hawaiian themed, and there was just such amazing food. And so I'm a little logy from the feast. There's a sentence you probably didn't think you'd hear today, but I'm a little logy from the feast. And you say, what does that mean? Well, look it up. Logy. It's a good word. Anyway, today we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about the Sunday message, the process, the meaning, expanding on it a little bit as we head into the final hours pre-crucifixion of Jesus, and in particular Peter's adventures that night. I'm also a little logy because I went down a YouTube rabbit hole last night. Not just YouTube, I guess all of the internet rabbit hole. You ever do that? You get caught on a topic and you just like, you're fascinated and you keep reading and you click another link and you keep reading, and then before you know it, like hours have flown by. That happened to me. That happens to me more than I'd like to admit. But have you heard about, this is the rabbit hole I went down last night. Have you heard about the Forrest Fenn treasure? Some of you probably have, but if you haven't, this was a antiques dealer from Santa Fe who in 2010 decided to hide a box, like a size of like a cigar box, maybe a little taller, somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. And then he wrote a book with a particular poem leading people to this. But inside was like a couple $1 million worth of coins and bracelets and just stuff he had accrued. And his whole point was he wanted people to get outdoors and enjoy the Rocky Mountains, which he had grown to love. But he just said it's somewhere in the United States in the Rocky Mountains, north of Santa Fe. So word kind of got out, and for a few years, there was a handful of people that went looking for it, trying to solve the clues of this poem. And then from like 2016 until 2020, it just became this thing, like this viral thing. And what was fascinating to me was it's been found. So the treasure's been found. There's pictures that prove it. The guy who found it has kind of revealed himself, but he won't reveal where he found it, other than it's in Wyoming. And Forrest Fenn, the guy who hid it, confirmed that, yes, this is my box. Yes, you found it. Yes, this is the treasure. They took pictures together, but he died last fall. So now it's like phase 2 of this huge treasure hunt, which is the guy who found it won't divulge where it was. So you have these categories of people. There's categories of other treasure hunters that are like, it's a fraud, it's fake. He didn't really find it because I knew the solution, and they must have moved it from where it was, where I was about to find it. And Forrest told this guy where it was, and therefore the whole thing was a fraud, and I'm taking it personally, and I'm going to respond. I mean, there's lawsuits against this guy. It's really there's a whole category of people who just refuse to believe because they put in so much energy and so much time and so much of themselves into this. I can do it. Then there's a group of people that are like, well, that was fun for what it was. I did enjoy the hunt, or I enjoyed reading about the hunt. Who doesn't love a good treasure hunt? And then it was found. Good for that guy. Let's all get on with our lives. That's the majority of people. You know, they've written congratulatory comments to the guy and all this stuff. But then there's a third group of people that are like, well, I believe he found it, but he didn't divulge it. So the search continues, just without the prize at the end, to find the spot. And now it's narrowed down to just one state. And so I was poking around the internet, and I'm finding like just piles and piles and piles of chatter and threads of people talking. And here's what we found. And when they went back and found the guy who did find the treasure, apparently posted on Reddit, you know, with a username and all this, as part of kind of everybody's looking at the same time. And then once he found it, he tried to delete all those posts because he was talking about his process in those posts as he was doing it, and then he had to delete them because he didn't want people following his footsteps. Because the whole point was, this is a very personal spot for Forrest, the guy who hid the treasure, and the guy who found it didn't want to turn into a tourist destination and ruin the beauty of the area by revealing where it was and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, I was just fascinated by this. And I'm reading it, and it was weird because I started to have that adrenaline feeling of, man, what must it have been like if you knew you had the right solution and you're hiking through the woods and you know exactly where you're headed. Those moments of confidence and yet fear and doubt, but also, I got it, I'm excited. And maybe like this guy experienced, and then he gets to the spot and it's actually there, or you get to the spot and it's not there. But it's the build up to that I was just so fascinated by, because I started feeling some of that just sitting at home reading this on my computer. What would it be like to have that? Maybe I got it this time. Maybe I'm going to be the one who finds it. And then you have this whole other group of people that it's like, all the evidence in the world, all the photographic evidence, if this guy doesn't detail every little thing that he thought, we're just not going to believe it. It can't be real. But then, of course, even if he did, they might still say, no, I was right all along. It was in Durango, Colorado. It's not in Wyoming at all. Like, how much evidence do you need to finally say, I was barking up the wrong tree? Good for you, man. Now I know the truth. Anyway, I was thinking about that a lot, and even getting the reaction of it. And it made me realize this morning, as I was trying to wake up via caffeine after my plunge into that rabbit hole, just how much treasure-seeking thinking is so consistent across the board. Like, there's an old Humphrey Bogart movie, The Treasure of Sierra Madre, which I highly recommend. It's a great movie. But of course, once they find the gold, then they all turn into, there's infighting because they all want their piece and they don't trust the other people to carry it. And you work at it as a team, but then it all kind of falls apart because at the end of the day, everybody wants it for themselves. And, those stories, it could be a heist movie. It could be, no honor among thieves is kind of the idea. But with a treasure hunt, there's this idea of excitement, of maybe I'll be the one who finds it. What would that feel like? Speculation. That really appealed to me. And I realized, how much in the Bible does Jesus talk about the kingdom of heaven being like that? It's a treasure hidden in the field. And when you find it, you're so excited. Or maybe it's not that parable. Maybe it's the parable of the lost coin and the woman who couldn't find the coin. And then when she found it, there was this adrenaline and this excitement, and I got to tell everybody about it. But then there's always going to be those active, passionate about their disbelievers. I almost said unbelievers, but I think there's like what I was finding in this, all these conspiracy theorists about the treasure, it wasn't that they were unbelievers. It was that they looked at the evidence and chose not to believe. They were disbelievers. And so much of how the gospel is received or not received, it's kind of like, at some point, no amount of evidence will ever be enough. I remember talking to somebody years ago who said, well, if God really wanted me to believe, he'd rearrange the stars in the sky. And I'm like, you realize he already did that? Like, and only the wise men, only the magi figured that one out. Like, of all the people on the planet at that time, he did rearrange the stars in the sky and said, this is where the Messiah is. And Herod and all of his advisors, they didn't see it. He was a bunch of pagan wizards from a faraway land that saw it and got it. So how much evidence is enough evidence to be satisfying? I guess that was my question. But then also just the social dynamics and the anthropology of it all. the psychology of it all, that it's very clearly these three groups of, okay, that was good, I'm satisfied with the answer, or no, the whole thing is, I'm going to choose to disbelieve it because it would cost me too much, or I'd have to admit my own errors too much. Or then the other people are like, oh, it still can be fun. Let's still have fun with this. I found that fascinating. And I'm not sure everything connects metaphorically to something spiritual, but it was weird to feel my own sense of excitement, like picturing myself walking through a forest in Wyoming, following clues and being like, I bet it's right around the corner. Like, isn't that cool? It's just cool to think about. But then I think about, don't store up for yourself treasures here where moth and rust will destroy. Instead, store up treasures in heaven, which are eternal, where moth and rust can't destroy. And imagine that you're looking for that treasure. Imagine that you're on the hunt for something that will be with you past death. Because Forrest, the guy who did it, he died. And the guy who found it, he's going to die. In fact, he's actually trying to actively sell the treasure to pay off old medical school bills, which I find that fascinating too. You found a treasure, so that what will it do for you? What will it gain you? Well, it'll help me get out of debt. Okay. The treasure of eternal life, the treasure hidden in the field metaphorically, that is the kingdom of God, we take that with us. It takes us with it, I guess, is maybe a better way to say it. And when was the last time I or you felt that excitement of the search, of the hunt for this thing, that when you find it, you're willing to sell everything else just to get the field where that thing is? Anyway, that was on my mind today, and it's already 12 minutes into this video, and that's all I guess I have to say about that, but it was fascinating. So if you want to go down a rabbit hole, Forrest Fenn, Fenn, treasure, pretty cool. But don't get wrapped around the axle. It's already been found. Don't believe the conspiracies that say it isn't. Believing conspiracies is a big problem, because we know now that whether it's Facebook or Twitter, social media, the news, we have proof that someone somewhere in these agencies is purposefully spreading false information to stir up conspiracists so that they can lead the conversation and lead the narrative in a way that they prefer. And it's happening on both sides of the political equation. So it's not just those other people. We're all susceptible to it, and it is being thrown at all of us. And so we got to be super careful to know what we know and not follow rabbit holes into things that aren't true just because they're fascinating. So that, I guess, is a word of warning from my little adventure last night as well. Anyway, Sunday, we were talking about Peter. And my process going into this particular passage was, I started with the reality that this was not going to be a new story for just about anybody in the room. Most people, if you've ever heard Peter's name, you've heard about the rooster crowing piece of the story. So I knew it wasn't a matter of, I'm not going to surprise anybody. I'm not trying to be clever. Let's just tell the story the way it happened. But then it struck me as I kind of had finished that first outline, that first exegetical outline is what we call it, the idea that you've done proper interpretation of the text and the text creates your outline for you. And so I'd done that, and I looked it over and I thought, I'm not sure, even though the story is about Peter, I'm not sure the story is about Peter. And I hadn't intended at first to include the beating of Jesus, the prophesy who hit you piece, because then it seems like that's where the story turns back, where Jesus is the main character, where here Peter's the main character. And so I was going to treat those as separate things. But as I'm looking at the outline, I thought, would Peter tell us that he was the main character of this story? And that got me thinking through, well, Peter did share this story with Mark and very likely with Luke. Most people would say, and I certainly would, that Mark is really Peter's eyewitness account, and Mark's the one who recorded it. I think historically that holds up very strongly. Whereas Luke, he, like we talked about on Sunday, he admitted he was essentially a journalist for hire who went and interviewed these people to give the most comprehensive version that he could find. So I think very likely that Peter told his story to both Mark and Luke. Matthew had his own version of the story, and also John obviously was there. So when you compare those four accounts, you start to unpack it. But I realized, okay, if Peter looked at my outline, this is the way my brain went. If Peter looked at my outline, would he say, yeah, that's the point? And I thought, I don't think so. And I've heard so many sermons where Peter is just like an analog for Christians. You know, when you fail Jesus, which you will, he'll reinstate you on the beach, metaphorically. And there is something to that. Obviously, the grace of God, the forbearance of God, the sacrifice of Christ on the behalf of all of us who have failed Jesus. I mean, that certainly is part of the gospel story. But I started to scratch my head and think, I'm not sure that's why Peter's story is here. So that's when I went back to the prophecy that Jesus gave him earlier in chapter 22 about when you have turned, strengthen the brothers. And that made me think this is a unique thing that Peter went through so that he could do the job Jesus had called him to in a unique sense, which is be the first leader of the church. And so I didn't want too much to turn it into a metaphor for all Christians' journeys. I wanted to talk about Peter. And I think if Peter had read my outline, he would have said there's not enough Jesus in it. Because the story isn't just about Peter denying Jesus. The story is about Jesus predicting it to the instant. The story is about Jesus standing and taking the beating, being made fun of for being a prophet, while Peter can't stand up and take a beating, even though he said he would, and just prove Jesus is absolutely capable of prophesying. And so to me, it was the contrast that totally opened up the story. And so then I kind of decided, okay, it's not just a 3-point sermon about Peter. It's here's what's Peter and here's what's Jesus, because they are absolutely contrasted on purpose by Luke. And I think by Peter in how he retold his story. And so it was important to kind of go through Peter's transformational journey from big talker to denier to filled with the Spirit to dynamic preacher to all the things that he learned about suffering for Jesus. Because you can't really tell a Peter story without including those things. But then I thought, I really need to bring in this prophesy who hit you part, because it really does act as the foil. When Jesus looks at Peter, the story hinges. And it's not like Peter's story stops and Jesus' story starts. That's the hinge point in the storytelling that connects the two. And so that was what went into this message that was written and delivered. And then I was trying to wordsmith it a little bit more, and that's where I came up with, okay, you have Peter on this side, you have Jesus on this side. In this scene, what's the word that describes each of them that is that contrast? And that's where I got to coward and courage. And just cowardice versus that loyalty strength to do what's hard because of your loyalty to, in Jesus' case, to the Father, and in Peter's case, to Jesus. And so anyway, that's how it was formulating in my mind, and I had kind of written that out to be the two halves of the sermon. And then, like I said in the opening illustration, we went and saw Dune Saturday night, and I'm watching the scene where Duncan Idaho is the character's name. He's played by what's the actor's name? He was Aquaman. Momoa. Yeah, Jason Momoa. Anyway, he's living out, I think, Peter's idea of what Peter was going to be for Jesus. He bows the knee, he's loyal, he understands the threat, and he comes back to rescue Paul and his mother, the characters in the movie, and he bows the knee to Paul the son, and then he gets them protected, and then the threat is coming, and so he gives his salute, which was awesome, the dagger, and then he locks himself into the room with all the bad guys, and just like that kung fu thing I was talking about, except with swords, and he takes out all of them one at a time, until finally he gives his life for his, I said king in the service, for his duke. And as I'm watching that scene, I'm thinking, yeah, I think this was what Peter thought he was going to do. And so that's why it became the opening illustration. And I thought, how am I going to use this as an opening illustration for the majority of people here who, A, haven't seen the movie yet, and B, probably don't care enough to see the movie, and C, are going to think I'm a little weird for talking about a sci-fi movie they don't care about. I don't want to lose the entire congregation within the first 30 seconds. So that's why I kind of expanded it to some of these other stories, that this is a pretty common trope in stories, but I think it is a common trope because in reality, the author of the trope is a guy like Peter, who wants to be loyal but can't, or fails in that loyalty. Mar really wants to see it, saw the first movie. All right, I won't give you too many spoilers, but I will say they clearly designed it to be 2 movies, which as the pace is going, I was feeling like, boy, I really hope this is going to be 2 movies, because I know the story and they're going at the right pace for me. But then when it ended and there wasn't a whole lot of resolution, the people sitting next to me were just furious. They're like, what? That's it? That's the end? So go into it knowing that it's kind of a to be continued vibe to it. But loved it. And that's the other thing. There aren't enough movies anymore where the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad, and all the things that go into a good story, including the plucky sidekick and the hero's journey and all that. It was so nice to see a movie where the villain didn't have a whole scene where he's like, well, I wonder if I'm the good guy here. It was so nice to see story beats that are redemptive, story beats that are more in line with how things really are. I think this last generation has so like, well, maybe the villain's just a misunderstood hero. Maybe the hero really is more flawed than we think, and let's do these anti-hero things. And so Batman is always brooding and violent and dark, and there's a darkness to the heroes, and maybe he's the good guy to the villains. And that's why I like Lord of the Rings and why I like this movie so much, because like these were books written before this whole shift in the culture happened, and so they still have that, I don't want to call it purity, but maybe that's the best word for it, just that clearly defined lines that are like, yeah, Darth Vader's not supposed to be misunderstood. He's the villain. And I know real life, it's not always guys in white hats and guys in black hats, but for a story to really have profound themes, I like that the themes aren't wrapped up in just weak and cheap characterizations. I don't know. Mars says perhaps it's because they don't know that truth actually is a real thing and exists. Yeah, I think that might be it too. I think it's still that smartest guy in the room syndrome. Everybody wants to be the smartest guy or girl in the room. And so maybe if we thought of it like this and we twist it like that and we subvert expectations like this, it'll make it more interesting. And the problem is when everybody does that, now if you really want to be against if you really want to subvert people's expectations, you need to go back to good being good and bad being bad, because nobody's telling those stories anymore. So when a movie like Dune comes out, it's like, yeah, somebody gets it. Yeah. So I recommend that. And I recommend just kind of when you're watching something, think through the themes. Because sometimes what everybody's favorite movie is, when you start thinking about it, you're like, huh? I didn't even notice that before. We were talking about this at our staff lunch just now, going through certain songs that are very famous songs that maybe you don't know the meaning to until you think about it. And then you're like, oh, I really used to like that song. And I'm not going to mention which songs we talked about, but there are those that are just kind of in the cultural cloud that we all live in. And we're like, yeah, When that song gets played at a wedding reception, I get up and dance, and it's pretty cool. And then somebody points out what it actually means and why it was written, and it's kind of like, oh, yeah. Well, I'm going to make it mean whatever I want it to mean. Well, I read an article. I will use this as an example. There's an article that Sting, the musician, the Police, which is one of my favorite bands. I have a Police T-shirt. I've worn it in these videos before. But the song "Every Breath You Take," which is completely and intentionally by Sting written about a stalker. He is a bad guy singing to a girl who should be afraid of him. And he said people have come up to him for years saying that, they got married to that song. It was their first dance. It's their song. It's so beautiful and romantic. And he's like, it isn't. And even after they find out what the song's really about, they're like, well, okay, that's fine, but it's art. So we bring our own interpretation to it. And he's like, yeah, but I meant what I meant when I wrote that song. Like, some things, some songs, some lyrics, some books, some art, some movies are intended to be open-ended and maybe, have dualistic meanings. But sometimes the artist knows what he's doing and he does it on purpose. And at that point, you have to say, no, there is author intent here, and I can't just make it mean whatever I want it to mean. And this is a key thing in interpreting scripture as well. One of the big challenges people always have is, well, how do you know it means that? You can't just make it mean what you want it to mean. And it's like, well, no, I know it's that because I know the history. I studied author intent. There's context clues. It doesn't mean whatever anyone wants it to mean. It means what Luke meant it to mean. The science of hermeneutics is the study of applying scientific study to meaning, so you're not guessing. And we have 2,000 years of orthodoxy that says, yeah, this is what it means. Now, some people can get a meaning totally wrong. Some people, some passages are intended to have double meanings, or God left them to not be as easily solved as others. But there are certain passages like, yeah, it means this, and you can't decide it means something else just because of the culture you're in. That's not how language works. Where was I going with this? Anyway, seeing themes in movies and such. Because sometimes you see a theme and you're like, oh, I got 3 minutes left, so let me tell you two of my favorites, in that they're my least favorites, but they're movies that everyone seems to love because they don't notice the theme. The first, and maybe my least favorite movie of all time, is Forrest Gump. Everybody loves Forrest Gump. Tom Hanks won an Oscar. It won Best Picture. They found a way to edit him into all these historical events. Isn't he such a charming guy? Life is like a box of chocolates. You know what the theme of Forrest Gump is? It's pure, uncut existentialism. Nothing has meaning. And your best bet to enjoy this life is to just be a feather on the wind. You never know what you're going to get. And so there's no meaning to anything. Just go through it, and the less you understand, the better you'll be. And it just grates on my soul when I watch that movie. And then, of course, his girlfriend essentially rapes him and then has his child, but doesn't tell him about him until she's dying. If those genders were switched, it would be just one of the most disturbing movies ever. But it's romantic, I think. I mean, even the whole thing where Forrest just decides to run and then he decides to stop. That takes up like a third of the movie. What was the point of that? Exactly. There wasn't. It was Lieutenant Dan who was trying to find meaning, and he was miserable. So you need to be more like Forrest and not care. That's what that movie's about. I can't watch it. It just turns my stomach. The other one, The Truman Show. Great movie. Jim Carrey, right? Ed Harris. Who doesn't love Ed Harris? I love Ed Harris. I can't stomach that movie. You know why? Because his name is True Man, and the bad guy in the sky running the TV show is called Christov. Christof. Christov is controlling True Man, and the goal of the plot is for True Man to escape the control of Christov. Yeah, I almost walked out of that one. But everybody I talked to was like, oh, I love that movie. It's so good. What I'm saying is you can like those movies. You don't have to agree with me on those things. Although the author of the book, Forrest Gump, pretty much has come right out and said, yeah, it's existentialism. But the point being, artists and authors have points they're trying to make. Creators create things because they're passionate about something, a perspective, a worldview. Even if their perspective is kind of like Jackson Pollock or Piet Mondrian, which is, we're just going to be random. We're just going to, our perspective is that there isn't order, it's all chaotic, or it's order, but it doesn't mean anything. Like there's a reason why even what seems like random art is random. And it's so important in not just what we think, but how we think about what's out there. And that's why sometimes the most redemptive, to me, best stories might be in movies I can't really recommend because of language or other situations, but thematically, they're gold. They're perfect. And some movies like that stand the test of time, whereas some others are huge popular works, and you start to dig into them, whether it's a book or a movie, and you're like, this is dangerous. And people are just eating it up by the millions. And that makes me a little nervous. And then sometimes I'm oblivious too until somebody points it out to me and I'm like, oh, but I love that show. Anyway, I don't know if I have a point on this, but anyway, I sat in front of a camera and this is what came out today. So speaking of themes, always think maybe what theme are we talking about on Sundays? And last week we were talking about the theme of loyalty and courage. This week we're going to talk about Jesus facing injustice in order to face justice from the Father. And that whole justice, injustice theme is certainly going to be baked into the sermon this week. So that's what's going on. It is our Super Sunday. We're mixing with Grace Latino. We'll have a bilingual music and sermon. And Ali and I have already started talking about how this is going to go. So that's going to be awesome. We have a couple baptisms, always good. I'll say more about that, I guess, in my Thursday update. So 32 minutes past the hour. Time for me to go. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful week. Last week of October. Enjoy the fall colors. Don't forget to blow out your sprinklers and turn off your outside water. For those of you watching, thank you for watching. Goodbye. For those of you watching later, sayonara to you as well. For those of you not watching, I got nothing to say to you because you'd never hear it. Okay, bye.